The mirror had no history, at least none she could trace. It wasn't bought, it wasn't gifted, and it wasn't passed down like a brooch or a set of linen. It simply was. One day, it wasn't there, and the next day, it was, hanging at the far end of the narrow hallway with a calmness that made its sudden arrival feel earned. No one questioned it. No one asked where it came from. It became part of the house the way certain smells or creaks become part of old rooms, quietly and without announcement. And in time it became something the household moved around, but never toward. It was not a large mirror, nor especially ornate. The frame was a muted black, touched with age but not damaged, and the glass never caught the light. In the morning, when sun spilled through the front windows and danced on every surface, the mirror remained dim. In the evening, when shadows lengthened and lamps cast their glow, it remained unchanged. It did not reflect the world. It absorbed it. Stand before it, and you would see not yourself, but something missing, a gap, an absence where your image should be. Not darkness, not fog, just nothing. A space shaped like you, hollowed out with precision. She noticed it first when she was 11. Her father had lifted her onto a chair to tie her hair before a school photograph, and in that casual, everyday moment, she turned to look at the hallway. She expected to see herself and her father, caught mid-laugh, maybe a bit out of focus through the distance. But what she saw instead was a blank wall. The hallway was there. The chair was there. But neither of them was. It was like the room had already forgotten they had passed through. Her father didn't notice. He was humming a tune from the radio, tying the ribbon too tight. She never mentioned it, not because she was afraid, but because something in her understood, even then, that the mirror wasn't broken. It was simply different. Years later, when she returned to the house alone, the mirror was still there. Same place. Same silence. And as she unpacked boxes of things that no longer belonged to anyone else, she felt its gaze, if it could be called that, settling behind her spine like a draft that knew her name. It didn't demand attention. It didn't pull, but it lingered, always at the edge of her sight, waiting not to show her what was, but what wouldn't be. She learned not to look directly into it, not because she feared what she'd see, but because the not seeing felt heavier. Passing the mirror was like walking beside a closed door you used to open every day. Except now, for some reason, you didn't, and no one could say why. It became habit, part of her movements. Step around the rug, avoid the creaky floorboard, glance at the window, not the wall. The mirror was not an object anymore. It was a rhythm. It had woven itself into the cadence of her days, like the slow ticking of a clock whose hands never moved. Sometimes, she left offerings without realizing it. A scarf placed on the side table beneath it. A letter unopened, left in its presence. A single dried flower in a chipped vase. She would forget they were there, until one day they weren't. And yet, the mirror never showed its hunger. Nothing was ever taken while she was looking, only when her back was turned. And each time something vanished, it felt appropriate, as if she had agreed to an exchange she didn't remember signing. Not a loss, a quiet surrender. There were moments, late at night, when she found herself standing too long in front of it, not drawn by curiosity, but by some quiet ache, a sense that something had shifted behind the glass. She would stare at the surface, watching not her reflection, but the faint suggestion of space. The mirror never glowed, it never shimmered, but it held depth, like a well that looked shallow until you leaned too far. It never showed her face. Instead, it showed absence, an empty cup on a table that should have been full, a shadow on the wall with no body to cast it, a coat hook bare that once held memory. They were not memories. Not yet. But they would be. One morning, she noticed a photograph missing from the mantel. It had been there since she moved back, a picture of her mother, seated in the garden, eyes half closed against the light. It wasn't a valuable photo. The frame was simple, the image slightly faded, but she knew it had been there. knew its tilt, its dust, the way it leaned a little too far left. Now, in its place, was a slight mark on the wall, a rectangle of cleaner paint, untouched by time. She didn't panic. She didn't search. She simply turned to the hallway. The mirror, as always, was quiet. She stood in front of it longer than usual. The surface was unchanged, dull, flat, faintly cold. But there, in the far background of the nothingness, was the garden. Not hers, not exactly, but close enough to know. And in that garden, the chair was empty. The light fell in the same slant as the photo. The sky had the same cloud, the same bend of breeze, but her mother was not there. It was the same scene, hollowed out. Not a removal, a foreshadowing. That was the first time she understood what the mirror did. It did not predict. It did not warn. It simply revealed what would no longer be, what would fade, what would fall away. Not in catastrophe, not in fire or blood or scream, but in the ordinary slow erosion that life does when no one is watching. And somehow, the mirror watched it all in advance, not to alarm, but to remember. After that day, she found herself moving through the house with a different kind of attention. She would pause before turning on a light. She would listen longer at the base of the stairs. She began to notice which objects felt temporary, which ones seemed to sit more lightly, as if their time in the world was borrowed, a cracked teacup, a fading scarf, a candle with a wick burned low. These things began to hum with the weight of future absence. And without knowing why, she started saying goodbye to them, quietly, with a touch or a glance, as one does to someone sleeping. The mirror never showed her how or when things would go, only that they would. It did not explain, did not narrate. It let her witness. And in that witnessing, something softened in her. Loss became less sharp, grief less jagged. She still felt the sting. Of course she did. But it came after a moment of recognition, not surprise, as if she'd been given the grace of a rehearsal. And yet, the mirror never revealed what she truly wanted to see. It never showed people, never faces, never names, only the echo of what they left behind. A chair no longer pulled back, a drawer unopened, a coat never claimed from its hook. It showed the outlines of presence through the shapes they vacated. And so, she came to understand that the greatest absences were not loud, but quiet. Not sudden, but slow. One evening, after days of heavy rain, she passed the hallway and felt the mirror humming, not audibly, but through the soles of her feet. The air seemed thicker, the shadows longer, and though the mirror did not shine, it held something brighter than usual, an odd clarity, as if something final had been acknowledged. She didn't stop to look, not at first. Instead, she returned to the kitchen, made tea, placed her hands around the warm ceramic, and waited. Something inside her knew it wasn't about fear. It was about readiness. Eventually, she walked back to the hallway, barefoot, the mug forgotten on the counter. She stood before the glass. It did not move. It did not change. But she saw something new. The hallway itself. Empty. Not just in the mirror, but in her chest. It wasn't literal. She knew she still stood there, but the mirror showed the hallway as it would be, soon. A hallway with no passing footsteps, no forgotten shoes, no scent of tea steeped too long. A hallway with dust that no one would brush away. Still, not ruined, quiet, not abandoned, just paused, waiting. That night she left the light on in the hallway for the first time in years, not to banish the shadows but to keep them company. She sat nearby, not looking into the mirror, but not turning away either. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the silence, and for a long time, nothing happened. No change, no flicker, just the house settling into itself, and the mirror, holding its truth. She thought about everything the mirror had never said, about the things it had quietly taken, and she realized it was never about warning her. It was about witnessing with her. Not a predictor, but a companion. one that stayed, long after others had gone. It would remain even after she didn't, not because it needed to, but because someone always must. When she rose to leave, she paused, then placed her hand gently against the glass. It was colder than she expected. Not icy, just absent. Like a room you left long ago, but still dream about. She did not expect to see herself. She didn't. But in the stillness for a moment, she thought she saw a book left open and a window unlatched. The kind of thing someone might forget, right before they never return. The next morning arrived without birdsong. Not silence exactly, but a kind of hush that seemed borrowed from a winter morning, though the calendar insisted it was still spring. The hallway, as always, waited. The mirror had not moved. It never did. But the light around it had shifted again. Grayer, flatter, as if dust had settled inside the glass rather than upon it. She didn't step toward it. Instead, she made her way to the kitchen, preparing breakfast with hands that had done it too many times to think. The kettle sang, the bread browned, and yet everything felt rehearsed, as though she were enacting the memory of a morning, not living it. She sat at the small table facing the garden. The flowers had not bloomed this year. They hadn't died either. They simply stayed the same, suspended in an almost state like actors waiting for a cue that would never come. Her spoon clicked softly against the side of the cup. The clock on the wall ticked 1 second behind. She noticed these things now, the rhythm of misalignment, the way time no longer folded neatly around her. She wondered if it was the mirror's doing, or if the mirror merely revealed what had already begun. Later, she found herself dusting the bookshelf, not out of necessity, but instinct. Her fingers brushed the spine slowly, reading titles she had never read, keeping company with pages she would never turn. A thin layer of dust clung to everything except one shelf, the second from the bottom. That space was clean, too clean, like something had recently gone missing from it. She knelt to check, though she already knew. The blue-bound volume of poetry, the one she never quite finished, was no longer there. She did not search the house for it. She didn't call it lost. She simply sat back, knees folded under her, and looked toward the hallway. The mirror was still there, still quiet. But in its depths, barely visible, she thought she saw an open book lying in the garden. Pages rustling in wind that did not exist. No one nearby, no chair, just the book, unread and left behind. She stood and closed the curtains without a word. The house did not protest, neither did the mirror. That evening, the mirror reflected a candle she had not yet lit. It was subtle, the kind of detail most eyes would miss, but hers had grown used to searching for what shouldn't be there. She stood at the end of the hallway, still barefoot, watching the glass hold the image of a small flame flickering near a window she didn't recognize. The candle rested on a narrow table, familiar, yet misplaced. She squinted. The wick bent left. The wax had melted just enough to suggest warmth, and something else, a recent presence. But the hallway behind her remained unlit. There was no candle. Not yet. She returned to her room and opened the top drawer where the matches were kept. They were still full. The candles beside them were untouched, wax smooth as stone. She chose one at random, cream-colored and short, and placed it in a small dish by her bedside table. That night, she did not light it. But as she lay in bed, she imagined the flicker, the scent of beeswax faint in the air. She imagined a moment not yet lived, but already observed. The house settled. The wind outside forgot how to move. And somewhere behind the hallway wall, the mirror waited. In the morning, the candle was gone. Not moved, not melted. Gone. The dish was empty, the drawer still full. Her hands trembled only slightly as she closed it. She didn't speak, not aloud. There was no one to tell, and even if there had been, the words would not have fit in any language she knew. The mirror did not show her where it went, only that it had gone. She walked the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of shelves, the frame of a painting no longer straight. Everything remained, but felt less. By the end of the week, the hallway grew longer. Not physically. She measured it once, just to be sure. But perceptually, it took more steps to pass. The distance between the kitchen and her room stretched in quiet ways, like a dream where destinations keep pulling back. The mirror had not moved, but it seemed farther now, and somehow more present. The edges of its frame had grown darker. Not with dust, with certainty. It knew something, and she was beginning to understand that knowledge in this house did not come from words. She stopped cleaning the house, not out of laziness, but reverence. The dust was not intruding, it was remembering, each mote a breath left behind, each smudge a mark of time passing without witness. The house wasn't neglected, it was becoming sacred. She moved more slowly, touched more gently. Even the act of pouring water into a glass felt ceremonial, like she was preserving the last of something. Not water, not glass, but the moment between them. She dreamed often now. Not of people, not even of memories, but of textures. The feel of a doorknob slightly loose in the hand, the cold ceramic edge of the sink, the precise sound of a page turning in another room. These details pressed themselves into her mind like echoes of things not yet lost, but loosening. And when she woke, she checked the hallway. The mirror remained silent, but no longer still. The light around it trembled, like air above something too warm to touch. She once placed a glass of water on the table across from the mirror, not as a test, not as an offering, but as a gesture. It was something she had always done, for guests, for quiet company, for the kind of presence that didn't need a name. The glass stayed for days. She changed the water once. On the third day, the water level dipped, though she hadn't touched it. On the fourth, the glass was gone. No sound, no trace, just a faint ring of moisture on the wood. She sat beside that mark for hours, fingers curled around the edge of her chair. The house felt heavier, not oppressive, not cruel, just full of time, of moments compressed into silence, of everything unspoken pressing gently at the walls. She looked toward the hallway once, and the mirror showed her the room she sat in, identical but quieter. The moisture mark was gone, the table slightly warped, the chair empty. She began writing down what disappeared, a list tucked into the folds of an old book, but each time she returned to it, the ink had faded more, not smudged, not erased, just faded, like memory does when no one repeats it. Eventually, she stopped writing. The list wasn't for remembering, it was for accepting, and she had already learned how to do that with her eyes. The mirror began showing things that hadn't yet existed. A coat with buttons she did not own, a doorway that opened to a wall, a clock that ticked backward. They were never prominent, never centered, always in the corners, the background, behind something else. She didn't question them. They felt true in the way future things often do, misplaced, but inevitable. One morning she found the mirror reflecting a small garden statue, marble, weathered, with its face worn smooth. She had never seen it before. It stood among low flowers, a hand outstretched as if in offering. That evening, she found the same statue in her backyard, not placed, not delivered, grown, as if it had always been there, buried beneath the soil, and had simply remembered how to surface. She didn't touch it. She didn't tell anyone. She only watched, and the mirror watched back. From that day on, the garden changed more quickly than the house. Flowers bloomed in shapes she didn't recognize. Paths shifted overnight. The sky above it seemed a little less permanent, the clouds like brushstrokes waiting to be revised. She watered nothing, but everything grew, as if the mirror had begun to shape not just memory, but the world around it. There came a night when she couldn't sleep, not from restlessness, from stillness. The kind that seeps into the bones and reminds you that the world has paused somewhere just out of sight. She walked the house barefoot, her steps quiet on the wooden floor. The hallway was darker than usual. The mirror did not glow. It absorbed the moonlight, drank it like ink into paper. She stood before it, not searching, not waiting, only being. And for the first time, she saw a figure. It wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone's. It had no features, no color, no movement, just a shape, roughly human, standing where she should have been. Behind it, the hallway was whole, the table intact, the painting straightened. It was not a vision of death or warning or even presence. It was absence given form. The space she would one day leave behind, already rehearsing how to hold itself without her. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch, she whispered nothing, only breathed, and the mirror for once gave nothing in return. Morning arrived with an odd brightness. Not cheerful, not warm, just bright, like the house had opened its eyes too wide. She rose without feeling rested, not tired but paused, as though the hours between sleep and waking had blurred into something weightless. The air held the scent of something misplaced. Not rot, not perfume. A scent like paper that had not yet been written on. She moved through the room slowly, letting her hand trail along the backs of chairs and the edge of the counter, grounding herself in objects that still remembered her name. In the garden, the statue remained, though it had tilted slightly east, as if listening. The soil at its base had shifted. Around it, flowers had arranged themselves in a shape she didn't recognize, spiral, inward, purposeful. She didn't touch anything. She only observed, the way one observes a stranger who looks too familiar to greet. When she turned to go back inside, she noticed the path had narrowed. The stones no longer led straight. They curved now, subtly, away from the house, as if encouraging departure. The hallway felt longer again. She counted 12 steps where there used to be 9. The floor creaked in a new spot, one she didn't remember from the week before. The mirror, ever unchanged, reflected none of this, or rather, it reflected all of it, but skewed. The hallway in the mirror was darker than hers, though no light had been lost. The shape of the table had altered, legs thinner, surface smoother, almost unused. And the corner where the painting hung was empty. She went to check the painting. It was still there, still crooked, still gathering dust. But in the mirror, it was gone. Not removed, not stolen. Gone as if it had never been hung, as if the wall had never borne the memory of its presence. She stood between them, the painting at her back, its absence before her, and felt the strange gravity of both truths. The painting remained, but soon it would not. And the mirror, in its quiet certainty, had already accepted that. She returned to her room, lit a candle she hadn't meant to light, and sat at the edge of her bed. The flame swayed as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. And in that moment, she realized something new. The mirror did not only show what would be lost. It softened the world ahead, gave shape to what would slip away, not to wound, but to prepare. It was not cruel. It was kind, in its own impossible way. It let her say goodbye, before she even knew she had to. Later that day, while dusting a shelf she hadn't touched in weeks, she found a watch. It wasn't hers. The band was cracked, the face scratched, the second hand frozen between numbers. It bore no initials, no memory she could trace. Yet holding it felt familiar, like reaching into a coat pocket and finding a stone you forgot you picked up as a child. She didn't wind it. She didn't set the time. She simply placed it on the hallway table just across from the mirror. It felt right there, like it had returned home after being away too long. That evening, as the last light faded from the windows, she passed the mirror again. The watch was still on the table. But in the reflection, the table was bare. The wood held only dust and a faint circle, as if something had rested there long ago. The hallway behind it was slightly darker, though her lamp still burned warm, and at the far end of the mirror's depth, the garden statue was missing. Not buried, not broken, simply not there. She did not panic. Loss by now had become a quiet language, one she no longer resisted speaking. She let the night wrap around the house like a coat worn soft by time. The silence was not heavy. It was deep. And the mirror, though unchanged, felt closer than it had in days. She could feel it now, not just behind her, but within her. Not as a presence, but as a knowing. The kind of knowing that doesn't speak, doesn't warn, only nods and waits. She began noticing other absences before they occurred. A spoon used less frequently, a chair that creaked less often, a book that no longer called to be read. These small details added up, not in grief, but in rhythm. The house was learning to subtract itself, not out of sorrow, but out of return. Return to stillness, to what had always been underneath. She started lighting candles without purpose, letting them burn down without ceremony. Not to remember anything, just to watch something disappear by its own will. In the mirror, the reflections grew simpler. The hallway grew emptier. The table often bore nothing. The floor lost its scuff marks. The rug's colors faded sooner in the mirror than in life. It was like watching a room forget itself. Slowly, graciously. She realized then, the mirror did not just show what she would lose. It showed how the world forgot. Not out of malice, out of mercy. One morning she entered the hallway and found the mirror reflecting only light. No hallway, no room, no objects, just a soft gray glow, diffused, endless, like dawn filtered through memory. She stood there for a long time, watching the absence of images, and somehow it felt fuller than anything she had seen before, as if everything she had lost was gathered into that light, not gone, but quieted, not erased, just waiting. A letter arrived. No return address. The envelope unmarked, yellowed slightly at the edges. She hadn't received mail in weeks, maybe months. She opened it slowly, more out of ritual than urgency. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank, but not empty. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, and when held against the window, she could see the faintest imprint of handwriting, erased, not written. A letter that had once existed and then thought better of itself. She did not search for meaning. She folded it again, gently, and placed it near the mirror. The next morning, it was gone. She didn't look for it. But in the mirror, where the letter had been, a chair now stood, one she didn't own. It faced the hallway wall, angled just slightly toward the mirror itself, as if it had been left behind by someone who understood. She stared at it for a long time, then turned away. That day, she moved nothing. She touched no objects. She walked without leaving marks. The house felt thinner, more translucent, like it had begun the process of becoming a memory before she had finished living in it. And the mirror, faithful in its silence, reflected the beginning of something that had already ended. She dreamed of the hallway, not as it was, but as it would be. The walls were pale, almost porous. Light leaked through in quiet beams, not from windows, but from something deeper. There were no sounds in the dream, no footsteps, no wind, just the presence of presence, an awareness that needed no form. The mirror was there, but not reflective. It pulsed gently like breath, like a slow heartbeat turned inward. And in that dream, she understood. The mirror was not showing the future. It was showing what memory would become when no one was left to remember. She awoke, without sorrow, just stillness. She poured a cup of tea, let it cool beside her, and watched as the sun rose only halfway into the window before stalling, like a clock pausing between seconds. The shadows held their breath. Even the floor seemed to resist creaking. She felt no urgency, no dread, only the certainty that she had seen something truer than daylight. When she returned to the hallway, the mirror was as always, but this time her reflection was not absent. It was obscured, not by fog or dust or light, but by shape, as if the space where she stood had been folded inward, hiding her from both worlds at once. It was not frightening. It was the beginning of her becoming part of what the mirror knew. She left the hallway light on all night, though no one would pass through it. It wasn't an act of habit. It was a farewell. The house, dim in the corners, hummed with the soft resonance of something ending. not collapsing, not vanishing, ending like the final note of a song that knows when to stop. She moved slowly from room to room, touching fewer things now, as though afraid to weigh them down with memory. The mirror no longer required her attention. It no longer flickered, no longer changed. It had arrived at something, and so had she. The air around it felt cooler but gentler, like the space beneath old trees. She placed one final object at its base, a folded handkerchief, embroidered with a name no one spoke anymore. She didn't wait for it to vanish. She only nodded, the way people nod at gravestones when words fail them, and as she stepped away, she realized the mirror had never reflected what she would lose. It had always been reflecting the space where she would no longer be, not as warning, not even as remembrance, but as preparation for a world quietly learning to hold her absence. There was no clear moment when the house stopped expecting her. It did not slam its doors or dim its lights. It simply adjusted. The floorboards creaked less when she passed. The kettle took longer to boil. Even the garden, once wild in its quiet blooming, grew still, as if it too understood the shape of departure. She still moved through the rooms. She still opened the curtains each morning and closed them again at dusk. But everything responded with less urgency, as though rehearsing how to continue without her. The hallway remained the same length now, no longer stretching, no longer bending. The mirror stood at its end like a punctuation mark on an unfinished sentence. She passed it daily, no longer seeking meaning, no longer curious. She had stopped interpreting its silence. It wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a rhythm, one that had taught her how to let go without letting slip. On one of those soft, unmarked days, she found a feather in the center of the hallway. Gray, weightless, curled at the edge like a sentence unsaid. She picked it up and held it against the light. It shimmered slightly, though no bird had flown near her windows in weeks. It didn't feel like a message. It felt like punctuation, an ellipsis at the end of thought. She laid it gently on the hallway table, beside where the watch had once rested, and turned toward the mirror. It showed the table empty. That night she dreamt of a house that wasn't hers but knew her name. The walls were translucent. The doors led nowhere but memory. There were no windows, only reflections, and in every surface a version of herself passed by. Younger, older, sometimes holding things she had forgotten existed. A scarf, a broken clock, a single glove. None of them looked at her, but each carried her presence gently, the way wind carries scent long after its source is gone. When she woke, the feather was gone. She did not mourn. The house had already learned how to let her go, and she too had learned how to return without staying. She stopped counting days. The calendar on the wall remained on the same page, though weeks had passed. The pencil beside it was dull, untouched. She let it be. Time no longer moved forward or backward. It only deepened. Mornings no longer followed nights. They circled. The hallway never brightened nor darkened. The light became even, like dusk folded over itself. And the mirror? It no longer showed objects. It showed patterns. Shadows passing where no one stood. Dust falling upward. Light bending gently toward a center she could not name. She noticed the smallest things with new weight. The faint smell of rain though the skies were dry. The way the air held echoes that didn't match her steps. Once, she heard laughter, but soft, thin, like it had been recorded on fabric rather than air. She followed it to the mirror and found nothing, not absence, not presence, something between. A hush where sound had recently stood. In the reflection, the walls had begun to lose texture. They blurred at the edges. Furniture thinned like old photographs. She watched as the mirror gradually stripped the world of its anchors, not cruelly, not hastily, but with reverence, as if gently preparing space. She understood then that it was not showing what would be gone. It was clearing room for what was coming. She began to write again. Not stories, not letters, just single words, placed carefully in a notebook she found beneath her bed. Words that had weight. Window, Wait. Quiet. All ready. She didn't explain them. She didn't arrange them. They were offerings, not records. The pages filled slowly. She never read back. That wasn't the point. The act of writing was enough. To press ink into paper, to remind time that something still moved forward, even if gently. She left the notebook near the mirror one morning. Not against the glass, just close enough to be seen. The mirror did not react. That evening, when she returned, the notebook remained, but the ink had faded to pale gray. The words still existed, but only barely, as if memory had learned to whisper. She did not rewrite them. She accepted their fading as part of their purpose. Days later, the notebook was gone, and in its place, the mirror reflected a small tree growing in the corner of the hallway. Impossible, beautiful, not there. Its leaves shimmered with colors she couldn't name. They looked soft, like sighs. The tree never appeared in real life, only in the mirror. But she visited it each day, standing still before it like one does before a painting too sacred to touch. The objects around her began to lose sound. Cups placed on counters made no clink. Doors whispered instead of closing. The wind moved the curtains, but without the familiar rustle. It was as if the world was practicing quietness, rehearsing a gentler version of existence in which noise had been excused politely. She didn't mind. It made her feel lighter, like each sound she didn't hear was a burden she no longer carried. One night, while pouring water into a glass, she noticed that the liquid didn't ripple. It simply filled the space. No splash, no motion. She drank from it slowly, the coolness still real, still grounding. But the absence of motion unnerved her slightly. She walked to the hallway, glass in hand, and watched herself not appear in the mirror. The hallway in its reflection was perfectly still, the water in the glass untouched. But on the table beside her, in the mirror, there was a second glass, already empty. She placed hers beside it. In real life, there was only one. In the mirror, two. She said nothing, only nodded, and the second glass in the reflection disappeared. She began to notice fewer doors, not closed, absent. The kitchen door had vanished. She didn't recall it happening. One morning she turned and it simply wasn't there. In its place, a smooth wall that remembered once being an opening. The room remained accessible, but the ritual of entry was gone. She ran her hand along the wall's surface. It was warm, familiar, the way skin feels when you press against your own arm, checking if you're still real. The mirror mirrored this shift. It no longer offered depth. Its hallway began to narrow. The distance from wall to wall closed ever so slightly. It reflected no movement now, only arrangement. The way furniture aligns itself in dreams. Not wrong, just approximated. The rug in the reflection now had no pattern. The lamp cast no glow. The corners softened like watercolor left too long in the rain. She sat near the mirror that evening, back against the wall. She didn't watch it. She only listened. And though no sound came, she could feel it hum. A vibration in the spine, like the echo of a song heard underwater. It was not warning her. It was recognizing her. Not as a subject, as a companion. Then came the first morning she couldn't see the mirror. Not because it had vanished, but because her eyes passed over it without registering. She only realized later when brushing her teeth that she had walked through the hallway and remembered nothing. The frame had not drawn her gaze. The space had not thickened. It had become, for that moment, part of the wall, as though it had fulfilled its purpose. When she returned to it, the mirror reflected only light again. Not her, not absence, just illumination, soft and directionless, as if something had opened within the glass and let the sky pour through. She stood there for a long time, her shadow faint behind her, barely present. The hallway behind her remained unchanged, but the hallway in the mirror had no end now, no ceiling, no floor, just distance. She reached out her hand, not to touch, not to test, but to acknowledge. Her fingers stopped short of the surface. The glass did not chill her skin. It did not resist. It simply didn't meet her at all, like air pretending to be solid. She lowered her hand, turned back toward the rest of the house, and felt something shift behind her. The mirror did not call. It released. She had begun to feel lighter, not in the body, but in the outline, as though the edges of her presence had grown soft, like pencil lines smudged by a careless thumb. Her footsteps no longer echoed. Her reflection, in the few remaining surfaces that still offered one, was slower to appear, like it had to remember how to shape itself before arriving. She did not resist this. It felt less like fading and more like returning. To what? She couldn't name, but it was familiar. Like the shape of a melody hummed from a childhood she hadn't thought of in decades. The house now contained more space than rooms. The corners seemed farther away. The walls no longer pressed in around her. Even her breath seemed to take up less room. She moved through the kitchen like smoke, past shelves that no longer held labels, past windows that no longer reflected back. She found herself standing in doorways, unsure whether she had just arrived or was about to leave. The difference had become meaningless. Time folded around her like a shawl pulled tighter at the shoulders, not to warm, but to close the distance between body and air. One morning, she opened a drawer and found it completely empty. It had once held spoons, notes, keys. She had no memory of removing them, but she also had no memory of needing them anymore. She closed the drawer softly, as one might close a book they knew they would never open again, not out of disinterest, but because the ending had already occurred. There were no marks of absence, no dust in their place, just the quiet, smooth space where something used to rest. The hallway had changed too, not visually, not in the mirror, but in the way it greeted her. It no longer noticed her presence. It no longer pressed with memory. The air around the mirror had settled into a kind of reverence, as though honoring what had already begun to pass. She did not feel erased. She felt witnessed. And that, somehow, was gentler than remembering. She began leaving small traces of herself, not to be found, but to see if they remained. A cup turned slightly to the left on the table. A drawer left half open. A single sock draped over the arm of a chair. Each morning she would check to see if the world had noticed. Sometimes the sock was gone. Other times, the drawer was fully closed. Once, the cup turned back to center. She never saw it happen, but she understood. The house was learning to forget her in increments, not cruelly, carefully. She no longer needed the mirror to know what would disappear. The knowledge lived in her now. She would touch an object and feel its absence echo faintly in her fingertips, like a tone already fading. A spoon became too quiet in her hand. A pillow refused to hold shape. The pen she used to write with stopped leaving ink, not because it had dried, but because the page no longer asked to be marked. These were not signs. They were permissions. The world was gently excusing her from itself, and still, she lingered. Not out of fear, out of love. Not for the things, but for the spaces between them. The pause between her hand and the doorknob. The breath held before descending the stairs. The sound of her own heartbeat slowing just before sleep. These were the things she cherished. Not presence, not memory, but the silence that formed where presence had once pressed. One evening, the hallway mirror did something it had never done before. It reflected the outside. Trees, a sky almost blue, a single bird frozen mid-flight, wings curved inward like parentheses around a sentence left unsaid. She stood before it, stunned not by the image, but by its clarity. The reflection was not symbolic. It was exact. But it was not her garden, not her world. There was no fence, no statue, no path, just wilderness, soft, unmarked, untouched. She leaned in slightly, hoping for sound. There was none, not even the hush of imagined wind. The trees didn't sway, the bird did not fall. Time had stopped inside the glass. She knew instinctively that this was not a memory. It was not a glimpse of what would vanish. It was a door, but it was not inviting her. It was simply open, waiting for the one who would choose not to look back. When she blinked, the reflection returned to its usual depthless shimmer. The hallway reappeared. The light dimmed. The table sat empty. But her breath hadn't caught in years the way it had in that moment. She turned away without touching the glass. She knew now. The mirror had never belonged to her. She had merely been trusted with its silence. Her voice disappeared before her body did. She tried humming once out of habit. Not a tune, just a sound to fill the air. But nothing came. Her lips moved. Her chest shifted with breath. But the air refused to carry anything outward. It didn't frighten her. In fact, it felt peaceful, like a long-awaited permission. Words had been unnecessary for a long time. She had merely forgotten how to live without them. The absence of voice made the world feel softer. Even her footsteps no longer announced themselves. The floor accepted her weight without protest. The door hinges no longer sang. She became a presence made of intention, not noise. A slow current through the house. She would place objects down with care, not out of fear of breaking them, but in respect for their coming disappearance. The house, in turn, responded in kind. Everything grew still, but not stagnant. The kind of stillness that holds breath, not boredom. She sat often now, not to rest, to listen. And in the thick silence she began to hear something beneath the floorboards. Not rats, not pipes. Something slower, something older. The heartbeat of the house itself, perhaps. Not a sound. A pulse. A memory being folded inward. And she knew then, without words or visions, that the mirror's silence had always come from this. It did not speak because the house had always been speaking for it. She no longer dreamed. Or if she did, the dreams did not return with her. Sleep became a drift, not a journey, a dissolving. She would close her eyes and wake in the same position, body light as linen. The mornings were not different, but her presence within them had thinned. Her reflection in the window now arrived slower than the sun. She began to forget her own habits. Did she eat yesterday? Did she water the garden last week? The answers didn't matter. Nothing needed her anymore. And still, the house held her gently, as if it too had learned how to let go without pushing. One afternoon, she stood before the mirror and saw nothing. Not light, not shape, not distortion. It was not blank. It was resolved. A space where questions no longer landed. The hallway behind her flickered softly, like a candle in another room. She did not move, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to move toward. The world had curled inward like paper in flame, silent, weightless, complete. She whispered nothing. She reached for nothing. She simply stood there, watching the space that no longer asked for her image. And in that final stillness, the mirror held only one thing: possibility, unspoken. That night, she prepared for nothing. She did not fold clothes, did not clean, did not arrange. She sat at the edge of her bed, hands resting in her lap, eyes tracing the shadows on the floor as they slowly receded from themselves. The house did not breathe. It waited. Not for a moment, not for a sound, for completion. The hallway, though unchanged, no longer required her passage. The mirror, invisible from her room, remained present in her thoughts, not as an image, but as an answer. When she finally rose, it wasn't decision. It was response. Her feet found the hallway as if the floor had asked. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because time itself had become fragile. At the end of the hallway, where the mirror waited, she stopped. Not to look, not to reflect, but to arrive. The mirror did not shimmer, did not open, it only accepted. Her shadow did not cast, her breath did not fog the glass. She stepped forward once, and was no longer seen. The house did not notice her absence at first. It continued its quiet rituals, the settling of beams at midnight, the creak of the stair that had always sighed when no one stepped on it. The curtains swayed gently with wind that had no direction. The clock still ticked, though it no longer matched the sun. Nothing was out of place. And yet, something had clearly passed. Not death, not departure. A thinning, like the light after a candle has gone out, but before the smoke begins to rise. In the hallway, the mirror remained. Its surface was calm, still. It reflected the narrow stretch of wall, the empty table, the space where footsteps used to pause. But now, it also held something else, a stillness that was not vacancy, a weight without presence, the kind of quiet that only exists after long companionship. No one walked past it. No one checked their shape. But the air around it remained charged, like a room where a secret had once been told and still lingered, unspoken. Elsewhere in the house, objects began to drift. A book nudged farther down a shelf. A shawl fell from a hook. A chair turned slightly toward the hallway, as if remembering the shape of someone who used to sit in it. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of place. But all of it spoke softly of adjustment, the gentle rebalancing of a space that had lost its center. Even the garden, though untended, did not wither. It grew strange instead. Flowers opening at dusk instead of dawn, vines curling in on themselves like questions that would never be answered. And within all of it, the mirror waited, not for return, not even for recognition, but for the simple, inevitable fading of the last echo of her presence. On the third day, the hallway grew brighter, not from sunlight, but from absence. It was not the kind of brightness that made things clear. It was the kind that softened edges, that removed the weight of corners and corners of memory. The mirror reflected nothing new, and yet everything had changed. The space it once echoed now folded inward, the way silence folds after a final note. There were no more shadows cast. The light passed through everything, even memory. A neighbor passed the gate that afternoon. She paused, hand resting on the worn wood, eyes squinting at the front window. Something had drawn her gaze. Not movement, but stillness. She stood there for a long time, as if trying to remember whether she had ever been inside, whether the person who lived there had once said her name. But no memory arrived, only the faint scent of lavender in the breeze, like the ghost of a gesture. She left without knocking. Inside, the mirror held its silence. The hallway breathed less deeply. Dust no longer settled. It simply hovered, undecided whether to land. The door to the back room drifted open at night and closed again by morning, though no wind stirred it. In the bedroom, a drawer refused to remain closed, and the garden, unwatched, unclaimed, continued blooming with names that had never been spoken. The house had not forgotten her. It had simply begun remembering differently. By the seventh day, the mirror began to dim, not visibly, but spiritually. It no longer shimmered with that faint pulse it once held. The glass was not clouded. It was simply still. There was no movement within it, no glow. It had become what it had always been destined to be, a space that held absence in perfect balance. No grief, no shadow, just the outline of memory set gently upon the floor. The hallway had shortened. It now felt like a single step. What once stretched and shifted with perception had collapsed into simplicity. The table stood as it always had, but its surface no longer reflected light. The air, though breathable, held nothing of scent. Even the hum of old wires had faded. The house was not dying. It was closing, quietly, like a well-written letter folded carefully and set aside. There was no ceremony, no final moment, just a gradual unfolding of space into something less solid. A window no longer resisted its hinges, a lock unlatched without sound. Books remained open to pages no one would finish, and somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, the memory of footsteps slowly evaporated. What remained was not empty. It was full of everything that had not needed to stay. In the weeks that followed, the mirror was no longer noticed. Visitors, though rare, walked past the hallway without turning. The house had become one of those places people passed with soft voices, unsure why they felt they should be quiet. It was not haunted. It was remembered, and remembrance required gentleness. Even the birds that landed on its windowsills did so without chirping, tilting their heads briefly before flying on. Inside, the furniture remained, but the impressions in the cushions had flattened. The bed no longer curled at the corners. The shoes beneath the bench were coated in dust that did not cling. A coat on the hook retained its shape, but not its story. Everything in the house was preserved, but not alive, like a memory pressed between pages, retaining weight, but losing warmth. And yet, the mirror still hung there, not forgotten, not defiant, just finished. It had offered all it had. It had shown all it was meant to show. Now it simply existed, like a final word no longer spoken aloud but known by heart. One spring, long after her name had been spoken for the last time, a family moved in. A couple, quiet in their movements, with a child who asked few questions. They repainted some rooms, replaced the curtains, removed the statue in the garden, though it returned the next morning half buried, leaning as if listening again. They didn't speak of it, only mowed around it. Some things resist replacement. The mirror remained. They tried to move it once, but the frame wouldn't lift. Not nailed, not bolted, just unwilling. The husband shrugged. The wife said nothing. The child stared at it for a long time, then turned away with the kind of solemnity only children understand. In the weeks that followed, they stopped noticing it, not by neglect, by design. The mirror faded gently from their awareness. It became part of the hallway, like light switches and baseboards, present but unremarkable. But once, on a quiet afternoon, the child stood before it again. No reflection, just light. A pale, unmoving field of it. He leaned in. The glass didn't respond, but his breath slowed. His shoulders dropped. He stepped away without touching it. And later, when asked what he had seen, he didn't answer, only said, "There's nothing there," and smiled. Years passed. The house shifted with time. Paint peeled, wood settled, roots pressed against its walls. But the mirror remained unchanged. Even when the hallway narrowed, even when the wallpaper curled at its edges, the glass stayed smooth, the frame unbowed. No one remembered where it had come from. No one ever removed it. It had become part of the architecture, like old stone in a cathedral, too ancient to question, too present to dislodge. Occasionally, someone would glance at it and feel a pause. Not fear, not even wonder. Just a softness behind the ribs, like a forgotten name brushing past the lungs. No one mentioned it. No one cleaned it. But dust never stayed long. Perhaps the air respected what had once been witnessed there. Or perhaps the mirror had simply learned how to carry itself without weight. On the quietest days when the house was still and the sun fell through the front windows just so, a faint outline would appear in the glass. Not a figure, not a face, just an absence. Curved slightly, like someone standing just out of view, not haunting, not waiting. Just there, as if to say something once mattered here, and the world remembered.